Hello there. Tonight, we're stepping into the stillness of medieval nights where entire towns didn't sleep all at once, but in quiet shifts. Candles flickered low, streets stayed guarded, and somewhere, someone was always awake. Why did they sleep this way? And what did the silence sound like? Close your eyes and drift through a world where sleep was shared like bread. Let me know what time is it where you are, and where are you watching from. If you enjoy this, gently tap subscribe or whisper a comment below. In the quiet hush of 14th century Bruges, long before the street lamps and clocks we now take for granted, sleep did not come all at once. Nightfall was not a curtain, but a slow fading of noise, the hiss of boiling water, the echo of footsteps across cobbled stones, and finally, the heavy toll of the belfry bell. That bell was not just a call to prayer or warning, it was a command to sleep. The first deep clang at curfew signaled the beginning of the town's slumber cycle, a staggered pattern of rest that stretched until the morning smoke rose again. From hearths. People did not all sleep at the same time. Many shared beds in shifts. Bakers would rise just after midnight to prepare dough for the morning, while watchmen took their place on high platforms, peering into the dark for signs of smoke, movement, or trouble. Sleep was not private. Rooms were cramped, often shared by multiple family members or unrelated tenants. Children, servants, and guests would curl around one another like firewood, preserving warmth in stone-walled homes where heat was fleeting. In many houses, sleep was segmented. After the first few hours, people would wake in the middle of the night, a period sometimes called the first sleep's end. They might pray, relieve themselves in the chamber pot, or even visit a neighbor for quiet talk or shared cider. Some would return to bed for their second sleep. Others would prepare for early labor. The bell governed it all. Its deep iron voice structured rest and wakefulness. Time itself was measured not by ticking, but by bells and candles both, of which burned down, slowly but surely, like the body drifting into sleep. To ignore the bell was to tempt fines, or worse. In Bruges, night was not for freedom, it was for structure. But how did the city ensure people obeyed the bell? Who enforced silence, and how strict were these nightly rules? The bell in Bruges may have marked the start of night, but it was the sergeants, low-ranking city officials, who ensured that the town truly obeyed its curfew. These men wore simple cloaks, carried lanterns, and held lists of streets to patrol. Unlike the romantic image of medieval knights, sergeants were more like walking rule books. Their job wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. They fined bakers who lit fires too early, scolded children whispering near windows, and sometimes even knocked on doors if they suspected late-night activity. For the people of Bruges, the night was not a time of freedom, it was a time of surveillance. Noise after curfew could bring suspicion. Singing, hammering, or even loud prayer might attract the sergeant's attention. The town prized silence, not for spiritual peace, but because quiet helped prevent fire, theft, and unrest. In a city built from timber and straw, even a candle left burning could turn a street to ash. The rules extended to visitors. Inns were required to stop serving at a certain hour. Travelers arriving late had to pay extra for admittance, and sometimes were denied entry altogether. Some towns had a night key, a single copy of which stayed with a gatekeeper who would unlock the town gates only for those with written permission. Those locked outside slept in nearby fields, curled under cloaks, listening to distant bells they could not obey. But silence wasn't only about fear, it was about rhythm. The medieval town operated like a body, its bell, the heartbeat, its sergeants, the nerves, and its people the sleeping muscles. Everyone had a role to play, even in rest. The baker's midnight dough would become the town's morning bread. The priest's early prayers would bless the new day, and the sergeant's lantern, swinging slowly in the dark, reminded everyone, the system is still watching. What happened if the bell failed to ring one night? If the city's curfew slipped, what kind of chaos or quiet would follow? In many medieval towns, nighttime wasn't simply a natural consequence of the sun going down, it was a legally enforced state of being. As soon as curfew bells rang, households were expected to reduce activity, lower their voices, and most of all, extinguish their candles. Light, especially after dark, was a privilege, one taxed, regulated, and often forbidden outright. Cities like London, Paris, and Nuremberg kept detailed records of curfew regulations that seem almost petty by modern standards. In some places, families were only allowed a single candle to last the night. Extra candles required a license or tax payment. Light after hours was associated with mischief, sin, or worserson. Fire in towns made of wood and thatch was not just a personal hazard, but a threat to the entire community. Candle finds were surprisingly common. Inspectors might roam the streets after curfew, peeking through cracks in shutters, or catching a glimpse of flickering light beneath a doorway. If a household was caught with unauthorized candles burning, they could be fined, questioned, or even publicly shamed. Records from Dijon and Ghent show people fined a week's wages for using candles after the bell, even for something as innocent as mending a torn shirt. But candles were not just fire risks, they were timekeepers. Many families didn't own clocks. A slow-burning candle was one of the few ways to measure hours. Curfew laws essentially regulated how people perceived time, nudging them toward sleep by limiting their sense of how long night lasted. No candle, no reading, no mending, no wandering thoughts tracked by melting wax. In monasteries and wealthy homes, special holders marked candles in hourly increments. The average working family, however, might burn taloa, greasy, smoky wax that gave little light and even less comfort. Still, even that dim glow was precious. The act of lighting a candle after dark became both a risk and a rebellion. What happened when someone refused to put their candle out? Were they resisting sleep or resisting something deeper? Not everyone in medieval towns obeyed the curfew bell. Some resisted out of necessity, others out of habit. For town scribes and local magistrates, this defiance created a quiet flood of paperwork, curfew violations, candle fines, and suspicious night movement, all neatly recorded in town ledgers that few ever bothered to read. Today, they offer a sleepy archive of small rebellions against the silence of night. In 1369, a woman in York was fined for leaving her candle burning while she slept. The court record states she had fallen asleep embroidering by the fire. Her crime, not extinguishing her candle. It burned through the night, drawing suspicion from a passing guard. The flame had caused no harm, but the risk was considered a public danger. She was fined the equivalent of 2 days' wages and warned not to repeat the offense elsewhere. In Bruges, 2 apprentices were caught whispering in an alley after curfew. They claimed to be walking home from the tannery, but their presence in a residential quarter raised concern. Guards cited them for disturbing the peace and unauthorized presence. Though no candle was involved, their nighttime wandering broke the fragile peace towns tried to maintain after dusk. Curfew wasn't always enforced evenly. Wealthier citizens were sometimes granted exemptions. Officials and clergy were allowed to carry lamps at night, though even they were discouraged from unnecessary movement. It was the poor who suffered most under these laws. Candle taxes were flat, fees meaning the rich paid the same as the poor, but felt it far less to keep towns. Safe cities relied on what historians now call passive policing. That meant encouraging neighbors to report one another for light, noise, or movement. Darkness was a shared responsibility. Breaking curfew wasn't just breaking a rule, it was betraying the quiet contract of collective sleep. Yet the number of violators never stopped. People still lit candles. They whispered in alleys, told stories, fixed boots, wrote letters, and dared to let time stretch a little longer. Curfew laws could dim a flame, but they couldn't extinguish human need for talk, for thought, for light. Was the silence of the night a protection or a prison? In the cramped homes of medieval towns, space was measured in inches, not rooms. The hearth where bread was baked, shoes were dried, and candles were lit was also where people often slept. The phrase, sleeping with feet to the fire, wasn't poetic, it was literal. In colder months, families arranged themselves like spokes on a wheel, feet pointed toward the dying coals, bodies radiating out into the shadows of the room. Shoemakers were among the trades most closely tied to the hearth. Heat, not just for comfort, but for softening leather, warming tools, and drying damp soles. Most worked from home, in ground floor rooms with small workbenches and even smaller windows. The more light you let in, the more you paid. The window tax. Introduced in several parts of Europe from the late Middle Ages onward, didn't just affect the upper classes. Towns like Toulouse, Cologne, and parts of England implemented versions of it that directly impacted artisans. Shoemakers, who often lived and worked in the same space, kept their windows small to avoid extra fees. That meant poor light during the day and an even darker world after curfew. To make up for it, fires burned longer, and longer fires meant more people sleeping near the flames. In some records, entire households 3 generations are listed as sleeping in the same room, often with apprentices curled up alongside family members. Beds were often little more than straw mats or wooden boards, and those closest to the hearth had to be careful not to let their blankets catch a spark. This strange configuration, feet to the fire, heads in the shadows, created a kind of communal sleeping geometry. It wasn't romantic or nostalgic. It was practical, cold, and often smoky. Children fidgeted, adults grumbled, embers popped in the silence. Yet in this shared warmth, life continued. Shoemakers stitched by firelight until their eyes ached. Wives patched sleeves. Elders told slow winding stories. It was in these low flickering hours that the rhythm of medieval life beat most quietly. But when winter deepened and firewood ran low, how did families balance light, heat, and sleep? And what happened when the window tax made even sunlight too expensive? The medieval shoemaker's day often began before sunrise, but it rarely extended beyond dusk, not because the work was done, but because continuing would cost too much. With candles taxed, firewood scarce, and windows too few to catch fading daylight, many artisans had to surrender to the dark, and so they closed early, not out of rest, but of regulation. The window tax, where it existed, was intended as a simple revenue source, had, under the assumption that larger homes with more light were wealthier. But in crowded medieval towns, where buildings were tall, narrow, and pressed together, even a small additional tax could hurt a working family. Shoemakers, blacksmiths, and tailors often boarded over their windows or built without them entirely to save money. This created dim, smoke-filled rooms where leather was soaked, cut, and sewn in near darkness. Apprentices squinted to thread needles. Journeymen pressed heels into place by feel alone. A shoe made at the end of the day might be slightly misshapen, not from carelessness, but because of shadows. The sun's angle mattered. Light came not only from above, but reflected off nearby walls and cobblestones. In cities with narrow alleys, it was gone by mid-afternoon. Add to that the candle tax, enforced in several towns, and light became an invisible expense. Only churches and noble houses were allowed wide windows without penalty. For everyone else, light became a daily calculation. Is it worth a candle to finish this pair of boots? Can I stitch by firelight without wasting wood? Shutters without inviting inspection. Some shoemakers moved their workbenches to the threshold of their homes, using natural light for as long as possible before pulling them back inside. But curfew laws complicated even that. Once the evening bell rang, shutters had to be closed. Even a soft glow leaking into the street could result in a fine. This fragile balance between labor, light, and law shaped not just how people worked, but how they slept. Less light meant earlier rest. Rooms waiting for second sleep to come. When shoes were late or poorly made, customers complained. But few realized they were not just buying leather, they were buying hours of stolen daylight. If daylight was costly and darkness controlled, what did night truly belong to the worker, the city, or the silence? Long before garbage trucks and sanitation crews, medieval towns relied on an odd but effective rhythm to keep their streets from turning into disease-ridden channels of waste. In Bruges, Ghent, and many other towns across Europe, this rhythm came to life through an event known quietly as public broom day, designated time, often in the dead of night, when entire communities were expected to clean their immediate surroundings. Public broom day wasn't a festival. It had no dancing, no feasting, and no music. It was a slow shuffle of wooden brooms and cloth-wrapped feet, a time when the town spoke in whispers and brushes, disease prevention and sleep management. The cleanup was always scheduled for the darkest hours, typically between midnight and the hour before dawn. The logic was simple. Streets were empty, shops closed, and movement limited. Night was the only time towns could be scrubbed without disrupting business or religious schedules. But this also meant that those doing the cleaning, the poorest citizens, often women and children, had to wake while others slept, guided only by dim lanterns and moonlight. In Bruges, records show that families living along certain alleys were assigned cleaning rotations. A missed sweep could lead to a fine or worse, public naming on the church door. The tools were basic: bundled twigs for brooms, buckets of rainwater, and cloths torn from old garments. The task: remove waste, straw, ash, and the occasional dead rat before the morning bell rang. The irony was that sweeping stirred more than just dust. The sound of brooms on cobblestone could carry through the night, waking sleeping neighbors or reminding insomniacs of the town's ever-moving order. In that sense, public broom day wasn't just about cleanliness, it was a soft reminder that even at rest, the town was never fully asleep. Some tried to sleep through the sweeping, others listened. A few woke early just to watch from shutters' eyes, following the slow choreography of brushes under torchlight. But what happened when no one swept? When silence filled the night, not just from sleep, but from neglect? In the medieval world, filth wasn't just unpleasant, was a threat to sleep, health, and city stability. The laws around street sweeping weren't moral suggestions. They were acts of governance. A dirty street wasn't just an eyesore, was evidence of lawlessness, disorder, and decay. And nothing kept people awake like the fear of disease or rats scratching in the dark. Towns like Bruges, Ghent, and Lübeck passed strict ordinances tying public cleanliness to nighttime peace. Filth encouraged vermin, vermin encouraged plague, and plague brought panic. To prevent this, many cities codified nighttime sweeping and linked it directly to curfew systems. Public Broom Day then became not just about waste, it became about sleep regulation. A clean street was a quiet street, and a quiet street made sleep possible. In Bruges, it was even said that a family could be evicted for repeated failure to sweep their doorstep. Town criers, in their evening rounds, reminded residents of their nightly duties, including clearing dung from the path and brushing down the drainage trench. Fines were logged for obstruction of rest, a legal phrase that meant you let your filth disturb someone else's sleep. Silence and cleanliness walked hand in hand. There were no rolling carts or loud brooms. Workers wrapped their tools with rags to soften their sound. Buckets were placed, not dropped. Lanterns were hooded to prevent harsh light from leaking into shuttered windows. Even the timing of sweeping, usually between the second bell and the cock's crow, was chosen for its fit within the larger rhythm of two-stage sleep. But the system was fragile. When sweeping didn't happen, the consequences were immediate, and people began to sleep less soundly. There are court records in Ghent of neighbors accusing each other of restlessness caused by neglected sweep. It wasn't drama, it was danger. And yet, not all sweeping was punished or forced. Some swept more than required, just to feel useful or to escape their beds. In the act of cleaning, there was motion, purpose, and a kind of quiet rebellion against passivity. If night was supposed to be a time of stillness, why did so many people choose movement instead? Long before electric lights, insomnia, and caffeine-filled mornings, people across medieval Europe followed a pattern of sleep that now seems strange, but was once entirely normal. They slept in two parts. This forgotten rhythm, first sleep, and second, sleep, shaped everything, from prayer to bread making to midnight visits between neighbors. The night did not belong to 8 hours of unbroken rest. Instead, most people went to bed shortly after sunset, especially during the long winter months. They slept for 3 or 4 hours. The first sleep then woke naturally, usually sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. During this quiet interval, they might pray, think, talk softly with family, or tend to small tasks. Then, without stress or urgency, they would return to bed for their second sleep, which lasted until sunrise or the church bell. Monastic records, medical texts, and personal letters from the 9th to the 17th centuries reference this practice casually, suggesting it was common knowledge. A French physician writing in 1500 even recommended first and second sleep as part of a healthy schedule. This wasn't insomnia, it was custom. During the space between sleeps, known by some as the watch, activity stirred softly across towns. Monks rose for nocturnal prayers. Bakers lit their ovens. Some women nursed infants in households where rooms were shared. These early hours were often the only time people had even a moment of privacies, only in their minds. The streets outside were not silent. Those who worked in the dark moved quietly: woodcutters, street cleaners, the night watch. Sometimes neighbors visited one another, especially in tight-knit communities where shared fires and borrowed candles were common. The darkness was not feared, only managed. People didn't speak of being tired in the way we do now. Sleep wasn't a single block of time to win or lose. It was a rhythm to follow, like the waxing of a candle or the toll of a bell. And for most, the night was not about sleep alone, but what happened between the two rests. But if this two-part sleep was so widespread, why did it vanish, and what does that say about the way we rest now? While most of the town stirred gently during the quiet watch between first and second sleep, bakers were already hard at work. Their ovens, massive soot-dark chambers built into stone walls, had to be hot before the second sleep ended. Bread wasn't a luxury in medieval towns, it was survival, and making it required rising before nearly everyone else. Bakers often lived above or beside their workshops. The line between sleep and labor was thin. Many slept in shifts, rising shortly after midnight to knead dough prepared the day before. Apprentices were sometimes woken even earlier to light the oven fires, using carefully rationed wood or dried dung. The fire had to burn long enough to heat the stones, then be cleared quickly so the loaves wouldn't char in the ash. This work was done in silence. Talking was minimal. Every movement, the folding of dough, the brushing of embers, the shaping of loaves, was practiced and precise. Bakers rarely used clocks. Their time was measured by the heat of the oven, the feel of the flour, and the quiet rhythm of the town around them. Church bells rarely rang at this hour, but the baker didn't need them. He could tell the time by other signs: a neighbor's shutter creaking open, the sound of wooden sandals on the street, or the distant cough of a night watchman. These were not official hours, but they were reliable. Once the bread was baked, it had to be cooled, displayed, and sold often before the rest of the town had even risen from second sleep. Women and children arrived early with coins or tokens. In some places, towns appointed bread weighers to ensure loaves weren't underweight or hollow. Bakers who cheated could be publicly punished. Bread was too important for shortcuts. Though their labor was vital, bakers were rarely celebrated. They were expected to be invisible, their presence known only by the warm scent of bread at dawn and the steady hum of morning customers. Yet their sleep was always fragmented, interrupted by dough, by fire, by timing. Bakers, more than most, lived outside the natural rhythms of the medieval clock. They slept between batches, between shifts, between loaves, and as the rest of the town awoke, stretching from second sleep into another detha, Baker was already cleaning ash from his hands, preparing to rest, just as the streets began to fill. Was this sacrifice a burden, or was it simply what night required from those who fed the day? If you were a weary traveler in 14th century Europe, you might have looked forward to a warm bed and soft blankets after a long day on the road. But most likely, what waited for you was a hard bench, a smoky room, and a seat against the wall, because many travelers slept sitting up. Medieval inns were not the cozy refuges often imagined in tales. They were crowded, noisy, and dark, more like oversized alehouses than quiet sanctuaries. Beds were expensive, few, and rarely private. A single bed could be shared by up to 4 strangers. For many travelers, the more affordable option was what the innkeepers called the common room. There, for a few coins, you could rent not a bed, but a seat near the fire and a space on the floor, or a bench to sleep upright, fully clothed, sometimes even with your boots on. This sitting sleep wasn't always by choice. Inns had to conserve space, and upright sleeping allowed them to pack more guests into one room. Wooden benches lined the walls, and guests leaned back against their satchels or wrapped themselves in cloaks. Some travelers even carried small, folding stools or travelers' chairs, which doubled as luggage and sleeping props. Why didn't they just lie down? Part of the answer lies in fear. Inns were filled with strangers, and theft was common. Sleeping upright meant keeping your belongings close, your sword or stick nearby, and your boots laced in case you needed to move quickly. Some even tied their packs to their wrists while they dozed. The air was thick with smoke from the hearth and the stink of unwashed bodies. Loud snoring, coughing, and the occasional rat made deep sleep difficult. Yet for many, this was the safest, most affordable rest they could find in unfamiliar towns or along dangerous roads. The very idea of a private room was reserved for nobles or clergy. Interestingly, innkeepers developed quiet systems to manage this chaos. Seats were sometimes rented by the hour. Some inns had designated dozing corners, where the fire's warmth lasted longest. A night's rest might mean several short naps between interruptions, more a patchwork of rest than true sleep. And when the rooster crowed or the town bell rang, travelers would rise stiffly from their benches, stretch sore legs, and step back onto the muddy roads, leaving behind the echo of snores, whispered prayers, and the fading heat of a night spent sitting up. But what kind of rest was this, and what did it cost the body over time? For those few who could afford it, sleep in a medieval inn was an entirely different experience. The wealthy traveler, perhaps a merchant, bishop, or tax collector, wasn't made to sleep sitting up. Instead, they paid for a bed right, the privilege of lying down under roof and lock on a proper mattress. But even this comfort came with curious complications. Beds in inns were not always private. Even paying customers often shared mattresses, unless they paid double for sole occupancy. Bed sharing wasn't always scandalous. It was common and, in some regions, expected. Strangers could be assigned to the same bed to save space, one sleeping near the wall, the other by the edge. There were even etiquette guides about how to behave when sleeping next to someone you didn't know. Roll away, speak little, and keep your hands to yourself. The beds themselves varied widely. In larger towns, wealthier inns might offer a feather mattress with linen sheets and a heavy wool blanket. In rural areas, the mattress could be a sack stuffed with straw, moss, or even leaves. Privacy was often a curtain, if that. Locks on doors were rare. Even in elite quarters, the sounds of the common room mumbling, footfalls, coughing crept in through walls. Servants of noble travelers often slept on the floor beside the bed or on bundled cloaks near the door. They kept watch, not just for safety, but to ensure their master was not disturbed by unwanted noise or late arrivals. In some regions, especially in the Low Countries and parts of Germany, innkeepers provided warming pans, iron dishes filled with coals to heat the mattress before guests arrived. This was considered a luxury, and sometimes even carried the inn's family crest. Inns competed for wealthy guests by advertising such comforts on signs or through town gossip. But even the rich couldn't entirely escape the unpredictability of medieval inns. A paying traveler might still find lice in the mattress or be forced to share space with a merchant's cargo. Complaints were often ignored, especially if the traveler was foreign. And yet, for the well-off, lying down, stretching legs, removing boots, feeling warmth was a sign of class, not just comfort. In an age where sleep was fragmented, noisy, and often unkind, the ability to rest horizontally under a woolen sheet was an emblem of privilege. Still, even the best inn could not silence the bell of dawn or the stir of hungry travelers below. Sleep, for all its cost, was fleeting. So what did it really mean to rest well in a world where even beds were shared and sleep was never guaranteed? Before wristwatches, wall clocks, or even pocket sundials, medieval towns relied on something far more elemental to keep time sound. And in the still darkness of the night, that sound came from one source, the town bell. Nearly every European town had a bell tower. These bells didn't just chime for ceremony, they were vital tools for marking the passage of time, especially during the long, uncertain hours between sunset and dawn. Night watchmen were responsible for keeping time after dark. Their duties included patrolling the streets, checking for fires, and most importantly, ringing the bell on schedule. But how did they know when midnight had arrived without a clock? They relied on approximate methods, measuring candle lengths, tracking stars, or listening to the flow of water clocks to guess the passing hours. These weren't precise, but they were good enough to divide the night into manageable chunks. Midnight wasn't a single moment. It was a stretch of time, a boundary between the known and the unknown. In some towns, the bell rang once at curfew, signaling that all fires must be covered and lights put out. Then, a second time around midnight, a signal for guards to change shifts, bakers to start their ovens, and travelers to prepare for departure before first light. It reminded them that someone was awake, that order still existed in the darkness. But it also served as a warning if you were still in the streets after that bell. Many people in medieval Europe followed segmented sleep, with a first sleep before midnight and a second sleep after. The bell, ringing in the middle of the night, marked the boundary between those phases. People would rise briefly between them to tend fires, pray, or even chat quietly before settling back down. The bell was more than just a sound. It was a rhythm of life, a heartbeat for a community that had no clocks. It echoed over rooftops, through fog, over snow-covered squares, reminding everyone of the hour, however imprecise it might have been. But what happened in towns when the bell was silent, when fire, plague, or war stopped it from ringing? For towns that lived by the bell, silence was terrifying. In times of plague, siege, or sudden fire, the absence of sound felt louder than noise. During outbreaks of plague, entire bell towers fell silent. The night watch was often among the first to die, and churches closed their doors. Without anyone to strike the hours, time dissolved. People awoke without knowing whether it was midnight or dawn. Inns opened late. Bakers missed their start. Prayer hours were skipped. The rhythm of the town collapsed. In places like Florence, during the Black Death, silence became the new timekeeper. Others, gripped by fear, stopped caring about time at all. Sieges caused a different kind of silence. Enemy forces knew the importance of the bell, and they targeted towers with fire or siege weapons. In some cases, townspeople removed the bell themselves, hiding it to prevent it from being melted down into cannon, but forgotten. And then there were times when the silence was forced by kings. During political rebellions or uprisings, monarchs would punish defiant cities by removing their bells. No call to arms. In 1382, King Richard II ordered the removal of the bell from Canterbury after unrest, saying, "Let them sit in silence until they learn obedience." Communities adapted, a living replacement for the iron bell. But these were never as reliable or as solemn as the deep, slow toll of a tower bell. Eventually, as towns recovered, bells were recast and towers repaired. The return of the bell was often treated as a sacred event, celebrated with processions and offerings. After months or even years of uncertainty, the familiar sound restored more than time. It restored trust, order, and a sense of safety. But in those long, silent nights, people were left to wonder, how do you live when time itself has disappeared? Sleep in a medieval prison wasn't rest, it was survival. Far from the stone castles and roaring fires of noble life, dungeons were cramped, cold, and brutally dark. And yet, every night, behind those thick iron doors, prisoners still tried to sleep. Cells varied widely. In large towns, jails were often located in the basement of the town hall or within castle walls. These weren't meant for long-term stays. They were holding areas for debtors, drunks, or those awaiting trial. But even for a single night, the conditions could be punishing. The floor was often bare stone, damp from groundwater or dripping. Walls, there were no beds, no blankets, just straw, if you were lucky. Rats were common. The air was heavy with mildew, sweat, and fear. And if you weren't chained to the wall, you might be shackled by the ankles. In some cells, the chains were fastened so tightly that a prisoner couldn't lie flat, forcing them to sleep upright or crouched. Still, sleep came. It had to. For many prisoners, rest was the only escape from pain, shame, or boredom. Some rocked themselves to sleep. Others mumbled prayers until exhaustion overcame them. A few used bits of clothing or straw to soften the floor, while some shared body heat with fellow prisoners in the colder months. In some towns, sympathetic guards allowed a single candle or permitted the prisoners to burn leftover food grease in a makeshift lamp. Even a faint flicker of light offered comfort. But light could also be the enemy. Prisons often had no windows. Inmates lost all sense of time. Night and day blurred. Some recorded the hours by scraping marks into the walls. Others counted meals, if meals came at all. Hunger gnawed at the edges of sleep, and anxiety about trials or punishments made true rest rare. The jailer's footsteps marked the only predictable rhythm. When keys jingled down the hallway, prisoners knew the night was breaking, either for a new inmate, a midnight confession, or a dreaded execution at dawn. And yet, in these suffocating corners of the world, where misery lingered like smoke, prisoners dreamed. Some dreamed of home. Others imagined escape. A few, with nowhere else to go, found a strange peace in their isolation, a stillness that came not from comfort, but from being utterly forgotten by the world above. But what of the long-term prisoners, those kept for months or years? How did their bodies and minds survive such endless, sleepless, dark? For those imprisoned, not just for days, but for months, even years, the challenge of sleep became a quiet war against their own minds. Long-term captivity didn't just test the body, it dismantled time, memory, and sometimes identity. Medieval prisons weren't designed for long stays. There were no libraries, no work programs, no yard time. Some prisoners were political enemies, debtors, or even wrongfully accused individuals who had slipped through cracks in the legal system, and many simply never left. They died in chains and tried, unheard, inside the cell. Days bled into nights. Prisoners often couldn't tell whether it was morning or midnight. The body's natural clock began to falter. Without light, circadian rhythms unraveled. Some inmates slept in fragments, waking and dozing at all hours. Others lost the ability to fall asleep entirely. To cope, many developed rituals. They would count bricks, recite prayers, or speak aloud to themselves, marking hours in their own way. Some constructed small sundials from light cracks in the wall, tracking the sun's path. Others carved tallies or calendars into the stone, scratching out days like sailors at sea. In certain dungeons, sleeping niches were dug into the wall, a shallow scoop of stone, barely wide enough for a curled body. These were not cozy. They were coffin-shaped impressions that simply offered a bit of warmth and separation. A few wealthier prisoners, if they bribed their captors, were allowed a blanket or even a thin mattress of reeds. Mental collapse was common. Prisoners often spoke of dreams so vivid they believed themselves awake, hallucinations of food, open skies, or family members long dead. In some cases, captives began to confuse memory with fantasy, unable to recall how they'd ended up in the cell at all. Solitary confinement, especially, tore at the mind. In places like England's Tower or France's Bastille, stories of madness from isolation were not uncommon. Yet not all were broken. Letters from prisoners show a surprising resilience. Some wrote poetry on the walls, using charcoal or blood. Others composed songs or invented games using stones. These tiny acts of imagination became anchors, ways to hold on to identity, to claim the self, even when everything else had been stripped away. Sleep, in such places, was not rest, it was retreat. An hour of unconsciousness meant an hour closer to freedom, or at least further from despair. And in the darkest corners of stone towers, even a dream, however brief, was an act of defiance. Imagine waking up at midnight in a wooden house or a stone cottage, wrapped in a thin wool blanket, the fire long gone cold. Outside, it's pitch black. You've just been pulled from sleep by a familiar pressure in your stomach. And in medieval times, when nature called, especially at night, it wasn't just inconvenient, it could be dangerous. Toilets, as we understand them today, didn't exist in most medieval homes. For townsfolk, nighttime relief took several forms, none of them glamorous. The most common, a chamber pot. These were small, ceramic or metal, bowls kept near the bedside. One simply squatted, used it, and slid it back under the bed until morning. Simple, quiet, effective, but not odorless. For those who didn't have chamber pots. The next option was riskier, stepping outside. Medieval towns weren't built for midnight strolls. Streets were narrow, unlit, and often muddy. People dumped refuse, including the contents of chamber pots, into the road. Walking barefoot, or even in soft leather shoes, could be a hazardous, squelching affair. Then there was the question of safety. Town gates were often locked at night. Local curfews meant wandering the streets could get you mistaken for a thief, or worse. Watchmen sometimes gave out harsh punishments for those caught outside after dark, especially in places like London, Bruges, or Paris. Even with a lantern in hand, you risked being accused of suspicious behavior or stepping directly into a pile of someone else's midnight problem. Larger homes, monasteries, and castles had slightly better options. These were vertical shafts built into walls, often overhanging the moat. A wooden bench with a hole dropped waist straight down, hopefully far from living quarters. But in cold months, these rooms were freezing, the stone icy to the touch, and if your room wasn't near a garderobe, you'd have to trek through dark corridors, perhaps with a tallow candle, braving rats, bats, and slippery steps along the way. In towns, public latrines were rare and always closed at night. For those living in tenements, shared facilities were overcrowded, dirty, and far from sanitary. So the chamber pot remained the most common and practical tool for midnight relief. Yet, despite all this, people adapted. Some used herbs to mask the smells. Others appointed night boys to clean out the pots in the morning. In wealthier homes, servants handled disposal discreetly. Still, with chamber pots under beds, garderobes echoing with the wind, and the threat of muddy shoes, or watchmen in the street, it's fair to ask, how did people keep from waking up their whole house every night? By morning, the night's quiet disruptions left behind a lingering problem, the full chamber pot. And in a world without plumbing, it wasn't just a matter of emptying, it was a matter of where and when, and whether anyone was watching. In the medieval home, this task usually fell to the woman of the house, or, in wealthier households, to servants. The ritual was simple but unpleasant. Take the pot heavy, sloshing, and poorly balanced, walk it outside, and toss the contents. But this was no private moment. Streets were public spaces, and many were narrow enough that one thrown pot could easily soak a passerby if they weren't careful. That's where the cry came in. Across Europe, people used a polite shout before emptying their pots. In England, it was often gardez-vous, believed to come from the French gardes l'eau, or watch out for the water. Residents would shout it from their windows, warning anyone below to clear out before the contents splashed into the street. But even with a warning, the smell lingered. Waste built up quickly, especially in crowded cities like Paris or York. Municipal regulations were eventually introduced, forcing residents to keep the roads clean or face fines. In some cities, public rakers were hired to gather and haul away human waste, sometimes to nearby fields, where it was used as fertilizer. Other times, it was dumped in rivers, a practice that made water quality a serious health risk. Yet, there were some innovations. In larger towns, communal latrines were dug over streams or open pits, and occasionally drained by flowing water. Monasteries often had surprisingly advanced sanitation systems, including sluices and covered drains. But for the average townsperson, waste disposal remained a daily, smelly chore. Some homes had cesspits-deep holes in the ground, where waste could be stored and covered with straw or ash. These required periodic digging out, a job dreaded and underpaid. Gong farmers in England, those who removed the contents of cesspits, worked at night. Due to the unbearable odor and public shame, their clothing would soak in the stench permanently. Few envied their work. Despite these efforts, medieval towns never smelled clean. By noon, the air often carried a thick mix of mud, manure, and rot. Visitors described the stench of cities long before they mentioned cathedrals or castles, but for the people who lived there, this was normal. Chamber pots were part of the furniture, emptied every morning, replaced every night. It was simply part of surviving in a world where privacy was rare and plumbing was a luxury centuries away. Imagine being the only soul awake in a sleeping town. The fire in your watchtower crackles low. Wind whistles through arrow slits in the stone. Outside the city walls, darkness, wolves, and worse men who steal, kill, or burn. Inside, peace and snoring. You are the night guard, and your job is to make sure it stays that way. In medieval Europe, towns were often surrounded by tall stone walls, sometimes with moats or wooden palisades. These walls were not symbolic, they were survival. During times of war, raids, or banditry, a town's walls were the only thing between safety and destruction. But even stone isn't enough on its own. Every night, a small team of guards was stationed along the perimeter, usually in rotating shifts. These men weren't always soldiers. Sometimes they were unpaid citizens drafted into service. Others were retired fighters with old wounds and better eyes in the dark. Some towns paid their guards in bread and ale, others with a few coins or protection from taxes. Being a night guard was lonely. You couldn't fall asleep, not even briefly. Punishment for dereliction could be severe. In some cities, a sleeping guard might be flogged or locked in stocks. In others, if a breach occurred on your watch, you might be executed alongside the attacker's dot. To pass the time, guards would walk circuits, checking gates, testing locks, and listening for any sound out of place. If you were stationed at a tower, you might peer through narrow openings, watching for torchlight on the horizon or shadows near the tree line. On quiet nights, the town might seem like a painting still, frozen as if time had stopped. But still, your mind would drift. Was that noise a fox or feet? Was the flicker on the hill a campfire or just the moon? Some towns had bells to ring in case of alarm. Others used horns or signal fires. In emergencies, the entire town might be roused from sleep within minutes, each citizen grabbing a pike or hammer, rushing to the wall in a practiced drill. But those were rare. Most nights passed uneventfully, and yet a good guard treated every moment as if it were a siege waiting to happen, with no clocks. Time was counted by candle length or sand timers. 4-hour shifts were common, though longer watches could lead to exhaustion and hallucinations. By the time the town stirred in the morning, the guard would be ghostly pale, chilled to the bone, and more than ready to hand over the post. Still, some took pride in the silence. If nothing happened, it meant they had done their job well. But as the sun rose and the town reawakened, was it peace or just luck? To most people, silence means safety. But to a medieval night guard, silence could be a warning. After weeks or months on the wall, guards developed instincts. Not superhuman ones, just finely tuned habits born of repetition. The way the wind usually whistled past the tower at midnight. The creaking of a tavern shutter left loose. The distant howl of dogs from a nearby farm. When any of these familiar sounds didn't occur or changed in tone, a good guard would stiffen dot in a time before. Security systems. This was how towns protected themselves, by trusting the senses of tired men walking cold stones. Silence could mean that animals sensed danger before people did. Bandits often moved quietly, and wolves, too, would avoid the usual noise. When even the mice seemed to stop scurrying, it was time to grip your spear a little tighter. Guards also had to watch each other. One man falling asleep could doom an entire gate. Most towns assigned multiple men to each wall section, not for conversation, but for accountability. If someone's pacing stopped, you'd check on them, and if their post was empty, then something had gone terribly wrong. The signs of a breach weren't always dramatic. A loose rope where none should be, a strange mark in the dirt, a gate that resists just slightly more than usual. Experienced guards were trained to notice these quiet anomalies because attackers, whether thieves or foreign soldiers, often relied on stealth, not speed. Even more troubling was the inside threat. Not all townsfolk were loyal. A night guard sometimes had to suspect those within the walls, smugglers arranging secret passages, or townsmen bribed to leave a door unbarred. Trust was hard-earned and quickly lost. Some towns required guards to write nightly reports or swear oaths before each shift. Others used secret tests, like placing a coin on a gate hinge to see if it had been disturbed by morning. False alarms were tolerated. Missed threats were not. And yet, despite this weight, most nights passed without event. A distant owl, a passing cloud, the guard pacing, yawning, listening, the world, for once, staying still. When dawn came, the relief would arrive, bleary-eyed and yawning, with a flask of weak beer or a heel of bread. The torch was passed, literally and figuratively, and the outgoing guard he'd descend from the wall into the waking city, perhaps unnoticed, perhaps unthanked. But his watch had mattered especially on the nights when nothing happened, because sometimes nothing happening was a miracle. Picture a narrow, cobbled street lined with timber-framed homes. The windows glow faintly with firelight. Inside, families huddle over stews, soups, and scraps of salted meat. Outside, a town official pauses in the shadows, listening not for screams or thieves, but for chewing dot in several medieval European towns, especially during the late 13th to early 15th centuries. Local councils issued noise ordinances that included restrictions on dinner-time behavior. It might sound absurd now, but making too much noise while eating clanging dishes, loud slurping, or shouting across the table could result in warnings, fines, or even public humiliation. Why? The answer lies partly in medieval ideas of order. Towns were dense, tightly packed places where hundreds lived side by side in multi-use buildings with thin walls and wooden floors. Privacy was rare. If a neighbor's family argued, coughed, or banged pots too loudly, the entire street heard it. And in a time when social hierarchy and public decorum were crucial to civic identity, disorder even at the dinner table was seen as a threat. City statutes from places like Bruges, Lübeck, and Florence record complaints about disturbing the evening peace through mealtime noise. Some regulations went further, banning music, singing, or storytelling after curfew hours. Others policed the kind of food gatherings permitted, limiting the number of guests or outlawing toasts with excessive cheering. A quiet home, it was believed, reflected discipline. A noisy one hinted at drunkenness, rebellion, or moral decay. There were practical reasons, too. Quiet nights helped guards hear intruders or fires. Loud homes distracted or overwhelmed this delicate soundscape. And not all citizens were equalsome, had the authority to report their neighbors for these offenses, often anonymously. What made this especially difficult was that dinner was often the only time a household gathered. After long days in markets, fields, or workshops, families talked, laughed, and shared news over food. But this could easily slide into unseemly noise. A broken bowl, a spilled pitcher. That might cost you a silver penny or worse, your neighbor's respect. Some towns enforced these laws strictly. In others, they were more symbolic, signaling a desire for order, even if they weren't always obeyed. But the fear of being seen as a disruptive household lingered. And so, meals became quieter, conversations hushed, cutlery was handled carefully, children were scolded for laughing too loudly, and doors were closed early. Behind those warm windows, dinner continued, carefully, choreographed, and always listening. But what if someone wanted to make noise? Eating dinner wasn't always just about food. In some towns, it was about loyalty. In the late medieval period, as urban populations grew and political tensions rose, dinner time became a surprisingly sensitive moment in the life of a town. Officials didn't just monitor loud chewing, they paid close attention to who was eating together, what they were saying, and how their meals might reflect deeper unrest. In places like Florence, Ghent, or Paris, noble families or powerful guilds would often host late-night meals for their allies. But in the eyes of town councils or ruling bishops, these gatherings could border on sedition. A banquet might just be a party, or it might be a meeting of rival merchants plotting to undercut city taxes. A supper could be the cover for rebellious sentiment, and so informants were employed. Some were paid citizens, others were pressured neighbors. They listened for signs of too many visitors in one home. Strange accents, mentions of landowners or foreign lords, disrespectful jokes told a little too loudly after the second round of wine. Even laughter could be a red flag, especially in households with known grievances against city officials. Regulations became even more elaborate. In certain towns, fines increased sharply if noise after dark came from a home already suspected of other infractions. Guests might be questioned by local patrols on their way home. Cooks and servants, who heard everything but had little power, were often questioned or threatened if something controversial was overheard. And then there were the curfew bells. These weren't just reminders to put out fires or close shops. They were also a cue to end dinner. Once the final bell sounded, even minor noise could be seen as defiance. Those still clanging dishes or laughing in the street risked being labeled troublemakers. This turned simple meals into acts of calculation. Hosts debated whether to serve another course or stop before curfew. Guests glanced at clocks or candle shadows. Children were hushed before stories could turn into laughter. Even when meals were legal and innocent, the fear of appearing unruly shaped every bite. Not everyone accepted this quietly. In some cities, there are records of food riots sparked by curfew enforcement, especially when poor families were targeted, while wealthy homes remained untouched. There were also satirical songs and poems mocking overzealous patrolmen, passed quietly between households. Eventually, these dinner restrictions faded, but, for a time, your evening stew wasn't just a meal, it was a test of loyalty, class, and control. Imagine it's just past midnight in a medieval town. The streets are silent, except for the occasional bark of a dog or the muffled clatter of hooves. Above the cobbled alleys, a small wooden window creaks open. A hand emerges, holding something, round, then a splash, and maybe a curse from below. For centuries, the problem of human waste in towns was handled in ways that seem shocking today, but were strictly regulated back then. Chamber pots, used during the night and stored under beds or in corners, had to be emptied somewhere. And in towns without indoor plumbing or proper sewers, that somewhere was often out the window, but not without rules. City councils across Europe, especially in denser towns like York, Bruges, or Bologna, created detailed ordinances about when and how waste could be thrown into the street. The most common rule, shout a warning, the famous phrase, Gardaloo, comes from Edinburgh and was shouted before tossing waste out a window. In French towns, one might yell, Prenez garde, l'eau, beware of the water. These calls were meant to alert anyone below to scramble out of the way. If you forgot or worse, did it on purpose, you could be fined, or even spend a night in the stocks. Timing also mattered. Some towns required waste to be emptied only after curfew, when fewer people were in the streets. Others had morning windows. Some designated alleys as waste lanes, where people were supposed to pour pots instead of the main street. Of course, not everyone followed these laws. In cities with rivers or moats, waste was often carried out in buckets and dumped directly into the water. This created obvious public health problems, especially when drinking water came from the same source. But the link between waste and disease wasn't fully understood, so the practice continued regulated, but rarely stopped. Enforcement was tricky. In wealthier homes, servants were responsible for emptying pots discreetly. In poorer areas, tenants shared small courtyards or relied on communal waste zones, which often overflowed. During festivals or market days, when crowds filled the streets, complaints about falling chamber pot contents increased sharply. Despite the smell, the risk, and the mess, these rules were rarely abolished. Instead, they grew more elaborate. Towns tried requiring lids on pots, nighttime inspection patrols, and even designated dump buckets at street corners. But one truth remained. At some point, someone had to deal with the pot. And what if they didn't? Behind every clean street, in a medieval town, stood someone whose job it was to deal with what others would not. They were called night soil men, and they worked when the rest of the town was asleep. These men collected human waste from chamber pots, latrines, and cesspits. Their work usually began after curfew, under the cover of darkness, with carts, shovels, and an iron stomach. In some towns, they were city employees. In others, they were hired privately, often by those rich enough to avoid doing it themselves. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't safe, but it was necessary. A night soil man would visit homes or communal latrines, emptying waste into large barrels or wagons. He'd then haul it to the town's designated dumping ground, usually outside the city walls. Sometimes the waste was dumped into rivers. Sometimes it was buried in deep pits. And in more advanced towns, it was actually sold as fertilizer to local farmers. The job came with hazards. Aside from the smell and the constant threat of disease, there were physical risks: collapsing cesspits, carts tipping over, or slips on slick cobblestones. In one tragic case, recorded in London, a night soil worker drowned in a vault. He was cleaning his cries, muffled by the layers of filth above. They were often reviled by others. People avoided walking near them. Children were told to stay away. Their clothing, marked by stains and odors, made them instantly recognizable. And yet, without them, cities would have drowned in their own waste. Some towns tried to regulate the profession. In Bruges and Lübeck, there were licenses for night soil removal, with official routes and inspection standards. Workers were paid per load, but also fined if they spilled waste or dumped it in the wrong place. In Paris, certain areas had their own night soil crews, known by name in their neighborhoods. Interestingly, despite their low social status, night soil men knew a lot. They saw every corner of town, overheard conversations, and understood where the poor and wealthy lived by the weight and smell of the barrels they hauled. Occasionally, they were recruited as informants, their nightly rounds making them invisible observers of urban life. Eventually, as sanitation systems improved and underground sewers were built, the need for night soil workers faded, but in their time, they kept the streets walkable, the air breathable, and the towns from descending into chaos. They were the quiet, unthanked backbone of medieval public health. In the heart of a medieval town, the tavern wasn't just a place for drinking, it was a public institution. And surprisingly, drinking wasn't just permitted. In some places, it was required. Yes, by law, taverns were more than watering holes. They were town halls, bulletin boards, and unofficial courtrooms. Local news was passed through mugs of ale, and many legal notices were read aloud to those gathered within. It was where guilds met, militia organized, and markets discussed grain, prices. And because of that central role, towns regulated taverns down to the barrel. In 14th century England, laws required every village to have at least one alehouse. The assize of bread and ale, established under Henry III, fixed the price, quality, and even the alcohol content of beer. Ale tasters, actual appointed officials, were tasked with visiting taverns, sampling the brew, and ensuring it met legal standards. If the ale was too strong, the tavern could be fined. Too weak, same penalty. Unclean mugs, unswept floors, or dishonest measures also drew punishment. And there was always someone watching. Patrons often reported offenses, not out of civic pride, but to avoid being overcharged. Taverns were required to be open at set hours, and often towns demanded that they remain open during festivals or emergencies. In some towns, tavern owners were fined if they closed too early. In others, they were required to keep extra ale in reserve in case soldiers or messengers arrived late at night. But perhaps the strangest law came from the Holy Roman Empire, where in some regions, citizens were required to drink ale during public assemblies. It wasn't about indulgence, it was about solidarity. The shared act of drinking fostered trust, conversation, and transparency. In one case, from 1468, a man was fined not for being drunk, but for refusing to toast his neighbor. These laws weren't just about control. Taverns provided warmth, light, and food things not everyone had at home. For traveling tradesmen or local bachelors, the alehouse was their only communal space. Regulating them meant regulating the social heart of the town. Of course, the laws also reflected anxieties. Too much drinking led to fights, gambling, or sedition. That's why town officials posted curfews, banned dice games, and occasionally forced taverns to shut for entire seasons. Still, the tavern endured, and in many ways, the legal system around it helped create the modern idea of public hospitality, regulated, watched, but welcoming. So what happened when someone drank too much, broke the law, or insulted the wrong nobleman over a mug of ale? As evening fell and tankards clinked across long wooden tables, the medieval tavern transformed. By candlelight and hearthglow, what began as cheerful conversation could quickly spiral into shouting matches, spilled drinks, and the occasional chair hurled across the room. Alehouses were not just cozy corners of camaraderie, they were powder, kegs of emotion. Towns knew this, so they didn't just regulate what was poured, they regulated what happened after it was poured. In many medieval towns, local laws required every tavern to appoint a watchman, a man either hired by the tavern or appointed by town officials. His job was to report fights, eject unruly guests, and even detain criminals until the town constable arrived. In larger cities like London or Ghent, entire squads of tavern inspectors patrolled drinking establishments to prevent riots and seditious talk. Fighting in an alehouse was no small offense, because the tavern was seen as a civic space. Violence there was considered a disruption of public peace, sometimes more serious than the same fight on a street. Penalties could include public shaming in the stocks, heavy fines, or being barred from entering any tavern in town for life to prevent trouble. Some taverns had house rules nailed to the door: no weapons, no dice, no politics. Others banned singing after certain hours or refused entry to anyone already drunk. In York, if a man entered a tavern with a dagger and failed to remove it, both he and the tavern owner could be fined. Interestingly, women were often banned after dark unless they worked there. Authorities feared that female patrons, especially those thought to be prostitutes or nightwalkers, would stir up immoral behavior or cause disputes. In places like Florence, taverns that allowed women to linger were labeled disorderly and shut down. Despite these controls, fights still erupted. Many began over unpaid tabs, spilled ale, or misunderstood insults. Sometimes the disputes were about politics, especially in times of town elections or religious tension. There are records of entire taverns erupting into brawls that spilled out into alleys and marketplaces, forcing curfews to be enforced town-wide. But taverns also had their own ways of maintaining peace. Some used peace benches, special seats for guests who promised not to quarrel. Others had last call bells, which signaled patrons to finish drinks and start heading home before tensions rose. In the end, the medieval tavern was a balance. Too much regulation, and the social heart of town would falter. Too little, and it could ignite chaos. In a medieval town, when the sun disappeared behind stone walls and thatched roofs, it wasn't just darkness that flit was law. Across Europe, curfews weren't just about sound or movement. Many towns also enforced a lesser-known restriction, the candle curfew. The reasons were not just moral, they were practical, and they were terrifying. Before modern fire services, a single tipped candle or neglected hearth could ignite a disaster. Homes were made of timber, straw, and wattle and daub, perfect fuel. A spark from a rushlight might leap from one wooden beam to another, and in tightly packed towns, entire streets could vanish in a single night, so towns acted early. From the 12th century onward, many passed ordinances requiring all candles and open flames to be extinguished at a certain hour, often signaled by the town bell. In Paris, this nightly bell was called the couvre-fire, or couvre-feu, a phrase that would evolve into the modern curfew. In London, households were expected to rake the hearth and snuff out torches by 9 p.m., while in small German towns, a watchman would walk the streets, shouting reminders, "Cover your fire, hide your flame." Anyone caught burning a candle, afterward, without permission, risked a fine or worse, suspicion. Authorities weren't just worried about fires. Light after dark encouraged gatherings, drinking, and by their logic, morality. The church and town officials viewed night as a time for rest, not revelry. If someone was lighting candles late into the night, it raised questions. Were they reading illicit texts, meeting secretly, gambling, plotting? In fact, it was rare for homes to even have enough wax or oil to burn light for hours. Candles were expensive. Most people relied on small rushlights, thin sticks, dipped in fat that sputtered and smoked. One or two were enough to get ready for bed. Anything more was wasteful or suspicious. Some households found creative solutions. Stone or clay candle hiders were made small covers to dim the flame without fully extinguishing it. Wealthy households kept candles burning in stone sconces high up the wall, where children couldn't knock them over. Still, fear remained. Fires were common and devastating. After a blaze destroyed part of London in 1212, killing thousands, stricter candle laws were passed. In some towns, only the bakers' ovens were allowed to remain hot after dark, guarded by stone hearths and thick doors. So how did people manage? How did they move through towns or work indoors without breaking curfew or risking punishment? After the candle curfew bell rang and the town darkened, a peculiar kind of quiet settled over medieval streets. But that didn't mean everyone went to sleep. Some still had to move: bakers preparing dough for morning, night guards patrolling walls, or travelers arriving late from distant markets. Without candles or torches, how did people navigate the night? The short answer is carefully and in the dark. Most medieval towns had no street lighting. The moon and stars were often the only sources of illumination. On cloudy nights, even familiar roads could turn treacherous. People relied on memory, touch, and instinct. Footpaths were often uneven, cluttered with debris, or slick with waste tossed from upper windows. To move safely, many carried walking sticks, not just for balance, but to tap the road ahead. Some wore clogs, or boots with iron soles, which made distinct sounds on cobblestone, warning others of their approach. In towns like Bruges and York, night travelers would shout greetings like a friend, or sing softly to avoid being mistaken for a thief. The town's night watchmen, paid or voluntary, were a common feature. These men carried lanterns, if permitted, whistles, or wooden rattles. They patrolled to enforce curfews, check for smoldering fires, and question anyone found. Outside, if someone had a valid reason, like tending to livestock or delivering urgent messages, they might be escorted home. Otherwise, they risked arrest or public scolding. For indoor activities, families adapted to darkness. Tasks were planned for daylight. At night, they sat by the hearth or simply lay in bed and talked. Many people experienced segmented sleep, a first sleep, then a period of wakefulness, followed by a second sleep. During that wakeful time, they prayed, reflected, or tended to quiet chores by touch. In wealthier homes or monasteries, glowstones or lamps with covered flames might be allowed. But even these were regulated. Too much light late at night meant drawing suspicion. Lanterns were rare and costly. Most common folk used none. Interestingly, taverns and inns, though officially subject to curfews, often pushed boundaries. They placed their tables near hearths, or built alcoves with high walls to contain candlelight. Patrons lingered late, whispering or humming softly. But if a town guard approached, candles were quickly hidden, and quiet fell. The medieval night was not silent, but it was cautious. It was shaped by fear, by law, and by the simple fact that fire was both a gift and a curse. In the hush of the medieval night, while the townspeople lay wrapped in blankets of straw or wool, a quiet business stirred in the back alleys and shadowed corners. The movement of human waste management, may sound like the dullest footnote in history, but in medieval towns, it was a matter of life, death, and law. Night soil, as it was politely called, had to go somewhere, in towns had systems, rules, and even curfews to manage it. Toilets, as we know them, did not exist. Most homes used chamber pots, simple ceramic bowls, kept under beds. By morning, these needed to be emptied, but not everyone waited for sunrise. Some dumped their pots at night, especially those living in tall, narrow homes without easy street access. In many cities, the act of flinging waste from upper windows became so common that laws had to be written and rewritten. In London, Paris, and Ghent, it was illegal to dump chamber pots after dark without warning passers-by. That warning, a shout, often something like "Gardez-l'eau," from the French "Gardez l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water." It was less a courtesy than a last chance to run. To control this messy routine, some towns enforced toilet curfews. Waste could only be discarded at certain hours and only in designated places. In Bruges, dumping after 10 p.m. could earn you a fine, especially if your waste hit someone or landed near a church or guild hall. But where did it all go? Towns had cesspits, public latrines, and waste carts, wooden barrels hauled out before dawn. These carts, manned by low-ranking workers called gong farmers, would scoop waste from pits and street corners and carry it beyond the town walls. The job was dangerous and deeply stigmatized, but essential. Still, curfews mattered. Too much dumping at night meant bad smells, blocked alleyways, and health risks. In hot months, it meant plagues. The waste attracted rats, flies, and other vermin. And though germ theory was centuries away, people noticed a pattern: more filth, more sickness. Enforcement was uneven. In some towns, the rules were ignored. In others, they were strict. If a chamber pot was found spilled in the street in the morning, neighbors might point fingers. Some towns even hired night soil inspectors, men who walked at dawn, noting where the worst smells came from. It raises a strange but serious question. In towns without plumbing, how did communities convince people to follow the rules of the night? If you were out late in a medieval town and caught the heavy stench of something foul drifting down a cobbled alley, you might have just missed the gong farmer a man paid to carry. Your towns waste away in the dead of night. The job's title comes from the Old English word gang, meaning to go. Gong farmers were tasked with removing human waste from cesspits, privies, and public latrines, usually after dark or in the earliest hours of morning. Their work was crucial, yet they lived on the edge of society, socially shunned, poorly paid, and often unwell. The route of a gong farmer was no ordinary walk. It began in the backyards of inns, monasteries, and tenements. Armed with wooden shovels, buckets, and strong stomachs, they would climb into cesspits, sometimes chest-deep, and scoop sludge by hand. Many cesspits were built beneath houses, requiring the floorboards to be lifted for access. In larger towns like London and York, they worked under torchlight or moonlight, careful not to spill a drop. Once filled, the waste was carried in sealed barrels on two-wheeled carts, creaking through silent streets. The barrels were covered with wet cloth or waxed leather to keep the smell in mostly. The carts made their way toward the town's edge, often to stiles, designated dumping grounds, where the waste was offloaded for later use as fertilizer. Despite the disgust, this was a necessary profession. Without it, towns would drown in their own filth. Gong farmers were sometimes given protective privileges, exemptions from certain taxes or guild rules, simply because no one else wanted to do what they did. But the job came with risks. Toxic gases built up in the pits, and there are records of gong farmers fainting or dying on the job. Their clothing was rarely cleaned, and they were known by smell before sight. Many were forced to live outside town walls, denied entry to churches, inns, and sometimes even markets. Yet, for all their hardship, they were part of a system that functioned. The toilet, curfews, and waste management routines of medieval towns, however, crude were attempts to bring order to chaos, and the men who walked these routes in the dark, with barrels full of night soil, kept the streets cleaner than they might otherwise have been. In the end, perhaps the real question is, what does it say about a society that its cleanest people relied on the dirtiest job?